Welcome back to another episode of Kerbal Space Program. I am your host, Sonat the Hero Type, and I guess it's the first episode of this particular series, which is How to RP1. Now, the very first thing I like to say is if you are new to this RP1 series, have reverts turned on. Now, you want to, if you have the mod pack I'm using, turn both this one and this other one off. So the milestones one and then the sat scan one. You just need RP0 on. The other ones cause weird bugs and issues. We're also using Kerbalism in this episode, or I guess this series. So here's a couple different options how the Kerbalism works. I'm just going to leave it at its stock base difficulty and call it good. Other than that, we're going to be playing at normal difficulty with normal starting funds, normal science generation, and normal everything else. Now that all that is out of the way, let's go ahead and get ready to start our new game and get into How to RP1. Now when you first set this game up, this would be the first things you see on the screen. We have the click-through blocker, which I always set to click. You don't have to, but it works better for me. And then we have the retirement dates, which we'll go over here shortly. We also have the Kerbal construction time up in the corner, which is glitching for me for some reason. Normally you get 2 points to start with. It only gave me 1. I kind of cheesed it back to 2. Hopefully you don't run into the same problem. Now, by default, you have a common build line between your space plane hangar and your vehicle assembly building. I normally turn that off. Now, the pros to that is you could build planes and rockets at the same time. The cons is you have to upgrade them individually. I feel like the upgrading individually is worth it. The other thing I want to touch on to in just a moment is how the launch pads and the vehicle assembly building upgrades work. But before that, we're going to go ahead and look at some of the RP1 screens. One of them being the maintenance screen. Now, in just a second, I'm going to pull the maintenance screen up, and you're going to see there's going to be some maintenance fees. There are monthly fees that run as you play in the background, so those will cost you money over time, and you need to be wary of that. In the beginning, they're not very expensive. You get 4 randomly generated astronauts, which you can change later, and I kind of pulled the screen up to show you that screen. I can go more into depth in it if you guys want in a later video. That's up to you. But the important thing is to realize that you have a day-to-day, year-to-year cost. Right here is where you can change the attributes, if it's a male or a female, the name, etc., stuff like that. But we're going to go over to one of the most important beginner screens, the KRASH screen. Now you have to access this from the main screen where we're on. And you're going to want to just turn all of these to 0, except for the last one, and make sure you hit accept. This will allow you to have unlimited free simulations. Now, the very first thing you need to do is go to mission control. And there are going to be 2 missions that pop up. Unlock starting parts and first launch. Make sure unlock starting parts turns green and then go ahead and accept first launch. Do it in exactly that order. Now, once you do that, you should be able to go over to the R&D building like we're about to, and you should see the first 2 of the 3 tabs turned green, as in they're unlocked. If you only have one of the 3, you didn't do this part correctly, and you have to come back and try to do it again. Anyways, we're going to pop over to the R&D building now. Now, as you can clearly see, the R&D screen is a lot different from stock KSP. There is a lot to this. I would recommend kind of clicking around and seeing what stuff does. There are some nodes that you will have to unlock that don't actually unlock anything. They're like stepping stone ones. You also have this spare parts one that's above here, and it's basically a bunch of non-RPO usable parts. You could use them, but they cause issues, and I recommend just stay away. Now if you're in a sandbox save, these will be already unlocked and there's not much you can do about it, but they cause nothing but clutter, headache, and quite frankly, I wish that they would just disappear, but I'm too lazy to use janitor's closet. The main ones you're going to be focusing on are the rocketry tree you have here, because you get upgrades for your engines, not just new engines. Material science, and then early airplane parts if you want to do X-planes. But as you saw there are actually upgrades you can do. And right here I'm showing you a quick example of one of those empty nodes that you have to unlock. The bigger ones are like specialty unlocks, like they're required to move forward. And if you look very carefully, there are arrows that go through this, so there are certain nodes you have to unlock before you can unlock other things. Like there are material science nodes you have to unlock before you can do certain human-rated capsules above. Now that we are back at the main screen, we're going to talk about Kerbal Construction Time and how the upgrades work. As you see here, you have 3 tabs you can pick to upgrade. Now normally you'd click on the launchpad and upgrade it, but as you see, you cannot do it here. You are able to upgrade the VAB, but it doesn't do what you think it does. It does increase build rate, yes, and it adds a second slot. But it's not increasing the build rate as you normally would in stock KSP, nor does it allow you to do bigger rockets. You have to actually build bigger launch pads, which we're going to go over in just a second. Now, if I come over here, I'm going to go ahead and come down to this where it says rename and new, and if I click new, we get an awesome glitch. Now that we've reloaded the game, the screen is back to normal. There will be different levels that add up to different tonnage. As you see here, the next one is 60 tons and it's going to take like 5,000 something days. Upgrading your VAB will change that. That's very key information that I didn't know my first time playing, and it saved me a lot of heartache in the long run. And now we go back, we see it's about 900 days. So the higher your VAB upgrade is, the faster your new launch pads will build. Now let's move over to the vehicle assembly building for the first time. Now we're going to talk about the VAB. Mostly the different things about it. First of all, we are in something called experimental mode. In experimental mode, you can use anything that's highlighted blue, anything that you've unlocked, anything that you are unlocking. When you click the little lab tab, it takes you off of it. So while you are in experimental mode, you can play around with things that you haven't quite unlocked yet as long as you're researching them, but in order to use them, you actually have to purchase them. Those purchase prices do get expensive. Let's talk about procedural avionics, because procedural avionics is a cornerstone of RP1. You have 2 types. You have controllable and uncontrollable. Now you need to set the control on the avionics to meet the mass of your ship, and early avionics are very heavy. This is about 30 tons, and it's, in the grand scheme of things, not that big. Which is why early on we'll be doing sounding rockets, which will use these little telemetry units. Now there's 2 basic ones you start off with, and they're both the whack corporal sounding ones. One is 0.3 meters and the other one is 0.38 meters. I prefer to use the 0.3 meter one, like so. It will have a basic starting science in it, but we want to add some more science to this. So we're going to grab some basic experiments and slap them on the side. There's also a lot of different tabs, so you'll have to get used to the new setup of the screen. Because we're using Kerbalism, science isn't instantaneous, it takes time. We'll go over that more when we get into the simulation screen, but for now, we're just going to kind of clip these into the telemetry unit, because using far in the realistic atmosphere Having those out on the outside could spell disaster for your rocket. Clipping and kind of meshing cores together is a big part of RO, so don't feel bad for doing it. Don't do it with fuel tanks because it will cause disaster. Speaking of tanks, there are multiple kinds of tanks in this game. Most of them are procedural. There's also the RO tank mod I do recommend. We won't be using those right away. The biggest difference is separate structure and service module. Service modules have their place, but not early on in the game. They cost a lot of money to tool, which we'll go over in a short time, and they weigh a lot more. You want to make sure you're using separate structure pieces. Now, like procedural avionics, you can customize the size and shape of these tanks, which is what we're going to do. We're going to use this top tank to actually make a cone. I'm kind of just going through the different types of designs they come with. You can play around with that a little bit more on your own and really make this rocket your own creation. Now, I usually go with the smooth cone because I like it aesthetically. There's not really too much of a difference between using that and the other cone types. It's just what I prefer. Keep in mind, you want to make this rocket as aerodynamic as possible. The atmosphere on Earth is a lot thicker than the atmosphere on Kerbin, as the gravity is also greater on Earth. There are tons of different ways you can set this up. I recommend playing around with it. I'm going to go ahead and speed up a little bit of this footage until we get to the next part, the lower tank. Now with the lower tank, typically you're just going to make this a cylinder and match it to the size. There are other things you can do, but this is a pretty basic general way of starting. Now, engine-wise, we're going to start off with the Aerobee engine. Mostly because it's just a good starting engine for your first launch. It's also kind of the standard RO RP1 setup. Now, this engine is pressure-fed, which means it has to have a highly pressurized tank, which we'll go over in just a second. It's also subject to ullage, which means you have to kind of push the fuel down in the tank, which we'll go over again in a moment. If you're using a program like TestLite, you have a chance of failure, which decreases the more you use it. Now, as you see here, we are going to be opening up the tank and changing it from high pressure to low pressure. And the weight of it is going to change. High pressure tanks weigh a lot more than standard tanks. Unfortunately, with pressure-fed engines, you have to have them high-pressured. There's no way around that. Later rockets in the game will get a little bit less picky, and you'll be able to be more flexible with your designs. The other thing to note is each rocket has a rated burn time, which I usually push the bounds a little bit on the early rockets, mostly because I prefer to I like to fly on hope, I guess. Just a few extra seconds to maybe get that little extra distance. Now, because the bottom tank is high pressure, you could actually leave the top tank if you're going to use it for fuel as a standard tank to save a little bit of weight early on, because this will be feeding into the high pressure tank, if that makes sense. Do not adjust the flow priority though, because it can cause pressure to drop and the engine to prematurely burn out. The other thing about the high pressure steel tanks is they can carry something called sounding payload, which we're going to be using a lot later on with our actual sounding rockets. Now, as you see here, I got about 22 seconds of burn time. We can go a lot more. We get 47 seconds, and I usually push it to about 52 seconds, give or take. You have two options. You can make it longer, or you can make it wider. Since the base we're using telemetry unit is 0.3, we want to keep the tank at 0.3. There are two different basic sizing adjustments. There's meter and 0.1 meter. Now we put it to 2 meters and it was at 57 seconds. That's a little bit too much, so we're going to scale it down just a little bit. So at 1.6 by 0.3 we have exactly 47 seconds with the current nose cone configuration. Again, I want to push this a little bit. I want to aim for about 52 seconds. Once we get to the rocket how we want it, we'll have a decent base design, but we're not done yet. Now I'm going to go ahead and fast forward as I make a couple of tweaks because I want to get this to about 52 seconds. Now that we have our tank set up how we want it, we're going to go ahead and talk decouplers and ullage. So there are some different decouplers you can use, and if you have a tweak scale, you can adjust these to the size you need. I prefer to use procedural decouplers on this first one for more of the aesthetic purposes. You can save some money by using one of these that I just put on there, but we're going to take that off here in just a moment and use ourselves a procedural decoupler. Procedural decouplers, like other procedural parts, can be shaped into different sizes and shapes, just like the tanks and just like the avionics. For this, we want to make a small, short one that's the same diameter as the tank, so 0.3 meters. Now, below this decoupler, we are going to put a small, solid rocket booster on here. Keep in mind this will add to the tooling costs, so if you're trying to save some money, use this the pre-generated decoupler. The Tiny Tim booster, which is one of my favorite boosters of all time, is great for this because it's the right profile for this rocket. Basically, the solid rocket booster is going to start sending the rocket upwards, pushing the fuel down to the engine, creating the ullage required to get a successful ignition. Another little side note is you're going to want to have the Tiny Tim booster and the Aerobee staged together because it takes a second for the Aerobee engine to spool up. So while you're being pushed off the platform with the Tiny Tim booster, we'll be able to go ahead and get the other one going. Now we're not quite done just yet. Now we need to talk aerodynamics. Aerodynamics, especially if you're using FAR, are a lot different. You can use these pre-made wings. They work just fine. You can scale them down so they're not too big, but I prefer to use the procedurally generated wings myself. They allow far more flexibility and a bunch of other benefits. And the nice thing about them is you can make small tweaks to them to adjust your center of mass versus center of lift. Because the Tiny Tim booster's on there, it's going to screw it up, so we're going to take that off. Now, we never want the center of mass to go below the center of lift when the tank is trained. This will cause basically the rocket to kick out and flip. We want to avoid that as much as we can. Now when you first pull out the procedural generated wings, they're going to be massive. And you can use, I believe it's a T, G, and H key. I don't use it very often, but you can make adjustments like so, using your mouse and dragging up and down. They're good for like quick wings, but I prefer to use the J menu, which we're about to open up here in a second. The J menu has a multitude of options, and you can use it to really fine-tune your wings, which is why I prefer to use it. Now, a little trick with the J menu. Using the left click will make it jump by a lot. Using the right click will make it jump by a little bit. So if you really need to just fine-tune your wings just a little bit, you can use the right click option to take it down a tenth rather than a whole number. You can also use your mouse to slide back and forth like so. Now, most people would tell you to do spin stability, but for your first rocket, it's not actually needed. You can use a set of drag wings, since we're not going to be angling this rocket, it's just going to go straight up in the air, and it's not that heavy. Spin stability isn't really a requirement. So I'm going to go ahead and make these wings real quick. I'm going to do this one in real time just so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And I'm making very small micro adjustments. Usually if you offset your wings a bit, you'll get less drag, which is what you want for a straight up rocket to get more height out of it. You also want to make sure that they're nice and thin because you don't want all the extra weight. But I kind of go for, it's almost like a triangle shape, but it's like a offset triangle, like so. And I'm actually going to shorten this down a little bit more before I place 4 of them on the rocket. There's another really cool button. It's a save as preset. So let's say you wanted to use these wings on a second stage. You can save them as a preset, and the next one you pull over will come out exactly how the preset was designed. You can always reset this with the other button also on the bottom. So now that I'm happy with my wings, I'm going to go ahead and get ready to mount them on the side of the rocket. Make a couple of quick adjustments, and then we'll go ahead and we will get to the KRASH menu. Now that I'm happy with the rocket, we're going to go ahead and open up the KRASH menu, and you're going to see it's going to cost me money because I didn't set it up correctly, which is why you always hit accept. Welcome to the launch pad, or should I say the simulation of a launch pad, because right now we are in a simulation within a simulation that's not within a simulation. Anyways, we're going to talk about a few things. For example, sounding rockets have no SAS control because they have no control. That is essentially what a sounding rocket is. It's an uncontrolled rocket set on a predetermined trajectory. Now, as you see here, our current throttle is 0%. That takes a second to spool up, which is why, again, we staged this rocket the way we staged it. By the time the solid rocket booster is burnt out, we should be at 100% throttle. We can hit the decoupler and then just launch straight up. A little keynote is you only have one ignition, and it's a non-throttleable engine, so make sure the throttle is turned all the way up before you stage, because if you mess up the ignition and it doesn't light, that's it. You don't get another shot at relighting the engine. Now over here is the Kerbalism screen, and when I said science isn't instant, this is what I'm talking about. You can access all of your science from here. This will show you how much has been transmitted. It should auto-transmit if it's transmittable. From here you can control all the scientific aspects of your rocket. Now, when I turn these on, you're going to notice there's a countdown next to them, which means it takes 10 minutes to finalize that experiment. And that isn't each area. This is landed. We have low above Earth, or shores, we have high, etc., etc., and then in space. So keep that in mind. You will be running the same experiments multiple times. I tapped out this window so you can see it actually change. But let's go ahead and get ready to launch for the very first time in a KRASH simulation. Now we're going to go ahead and stage the rocket, and then immediately stage it one more time to separate the solid rocket booster from the rest of the rocket. This will take some practice. As you see, as we start flying, the aerodynamic drag is staying at the bottom because of the way we did our wings. Spin stability works similar to this, but with smaller rockets it's not as necessary. You'll also notice how our science is starting to slowly go up. Now this rocket won't burn out prematurely because in KRASH, test light is disabled. So this will just fly forever. Keep that in mind, because if you overfuel too many things, they may not perform exactly how you expect them to in an actual flight. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the rest of this footage because it's just going to go up really high and then fall back down. We hit about just under 140 kilometers, which is technically in space, but it passes the Kármán line, and that was my main focus with this rocket. The one other thing I wanted to touch on was, you see all these missions that popped up that we completed? Those are the generated missions from RP1. Basically, they're milestones. So as you hit 10 kilometers, a 20 kilometer one will generate, so on and so forth. It isn't every 10 kilometers. Once it gets to a certain height, it gets greater and greater, but it does help you get a little bit of extra funding for achieving milestones. Now, because we're in a simulation, none of those actually count, but you can use them to see if your rocket would actually successfully complete a mission before you tool it and launch it. Now that we tested our rocket and we're happy with it, it's time to make it our own by designing it. You can use these sides here to kind of change the way the rocket looks on the side, and you can actually change the color of the rocket itself. Now, if you're not too big about how a rocket looks, then you can just kind of skip through this next part. But I like to make my rocket a unique rocket, make it something that I made. So I was going to kind of show you guys how those windows work. Now, up in the recoloring tab, there's different areas that change different parts of the rocket. You can make your own custom colors, or you can use the presets. That's totally up to you. Just because I'm going to make this a United States emblem rocket, because we are launching from Cape Canaveral. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a couple of quick adjustments. I recommend you play around on the screen to kind of get a feel for it, but it really does help the design of your rocket, and it really makes it your own. Now let's go into tooling and finalizing our rocket. Now when you come down to the RP1 menu, there's a little tooling section. This costs money to do, but if you're gonna make multiple rockets that are the same, it makes them cost less to build, it makes them build faster, and they don't cost as much money to actually roll out onto the launch pad. By clicking the preview button, it will actually show you the difference in build time and total cost, which, I mean, for this is a lot. It makes it almost $200 cheaper. It's going to cost about $1,800 to tool. Now, I don't necessarily need to tool this rocket because I'm not going to use it very often, but I'm going to go ahead and tool it so I can build it faster so I can get more rockets launched as early as I can. Now, when you stretch the tanks longer, you have to retool it. And if you look, it actually costs way more money to make the rocket wider than it does to make it taller. So if you upgrade an engine and it takes a little more fuel, it's better to stretch the tank out over making it a wider base. It will save you money in the long run, and every time you tool something at this particular diameter in the future, it'll be a lot cheaper. Now over here in our build menu, you will see that when I hit the launch button, it'll actually build the rocket. And there's a couple things you can do once they're in queue. For example, you could scrap the rocket. Let's say you accidentally built 3 of them and you only want to have 2 of them. You could just hit the X button and scrap the rocket and get most of your funding back. You can also edit and rename your rocket using the same screen on the main menu, which we're going to go over and check out now. Now we have our first 2 rockets in queue. We're going to go ahead and get ready to warp forward and build them. But first, I just kind of wanted to show you guys this whole, rename and edit screen I was talking about earlier. To help keep track of our rockets, we're going to name this the Mac Corpy number 2. Now you just kind of hit warp to next rocket, and I forgot I usually spend some of my money and I'll drop a couple of upgrade points in the VAB just to get these building faster. Now if this next launch goes good, we'll have enough money to put some points in the R&D and start some actual research. It's a bit of a gamble, but you don't need to store a bunch of your funds early on. There's no real point to it, and you want to get your VAB and R&D building upgraded as much as possible early on. Simply by adding those 2 points into the VAB, I've reduced my rocket build time by over 2 weeks. But we're going to go ahead and hit the rollout button, roll it out to the launch pad, and I will see you guys there. Now we're back at the launch pad. We're going to go ahead and make sure all of our science is turned on, make sure everything is set up. We're going to max our throttle, and then just like in the simulation, we're going to stage pretty much 2 times, one right after the other, and hope the rocket doesn't run out of fuel too quickly and manages to get at least over the Kármán line. Unfortunately, if you do get over the Kármán line in your first launch, it does take away an altitude rocket mission. But in the long run, in my opinion, you save money and time by getting it all done in this very first launch. So like before, I'm going to go ahead and speed up part of this just so we can kind of get through it, since we've already seen this rocket launched in the past, and get down to the end of the mission. Now, unfortunately, we didn't quite hit the 140-kilometer mark and get into space on this first launch, but we did break the Kármán line, so I can be happy with it. But we're already at about 32 minutes into this video, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap everything up. I want to thank you guys again for stopping by, and I really hope you guys enjoyed. When we come back, we'll be going into actual sounding rockets and quite possibly getting into X-planes. I originally wanted to add a sounding rocket build to the end of this video, but we were going to be at like 50 minutes, and I doubt many of you would have made it through it. We spent a good majority of the beginning of the video talking about all the little stuff with RP1 and RO, but now that I got that all out of the way, we can actually get down to the more specific aspects of the game and things that you may want to know, before you start your first RP1 career. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go, and I hope I see you next time in episode number 2 of How to RP1.